At this workshop in London, crafters are busy refining and repairing instruments. But while these cello and violins will soon be ready to perform in harmony again, in classical music, a divide is still present.
It was very clear to me I wanted to be a soloist. I wanted to be a tour the world with Rachmaninoff piano concerto and Chopin piano concerto, Beethoven, the Emperor. And my teacher told me, she was a woman, an amazing teacher, but she had this idea that only men could become soloists. Women were more suited to be chamber musician, so to play in group with other musicians, because we would have never been as strong as men, and so the sound would have never been big enough to fill a great concert hall by ourselves, and even less, of course, if you had an orchestra behind. She was giving the most beautiful pieces to my male companion, classmate in the conservatoires, and I was like, I want to play that, and she was like, but you don't need to play that.
The case of Stefania is not an isolated one. Still today, classical music remains very much of a man's world. A recent research by Quartz magazine found that over 2,000 full-time musicians playing in the world's top orchestras, over 1,000 were men. And among instruments, men and women are disproportionately represented. Dr. Christina Scharf is senior lecturer at King's College London. Her research identifies a male culture in the classical music field.
We have some instruments that are male-dominated or sections, so brass, percussion, double bass tend to all be quite male-dominated. And then we have some other instruments who tend to be very dominated by women, such as flute and harps. And then we have some instrumental groups in the middle, strings on the whole, especially the higher strings, so violins. You also have women represented there. What's interesting, however, is not only to look at the instrument groups and the representation of men and women in these groups, but also to look at who are the section leaders, who are the principals. And the higher you go in the hierarchy, the fewer women you have.
A staggering imbalance is present in composition. In around 1,400 classical music concerts held across the world in the last year, 76 included a piece composed by a woman. 97.6% of all performed pieces were written by men and only 2.3% by women. In Britain, institutions and music festivals have decided to change this by committing to a 50-50 gender balance by 2022. At the last season of the classical music festival BBC Proms, Karina Canellakis made history by conducting the first night of the Proms, the first woman to do so in its 125 years history. People working in the industry are eager to have more female voices joining.
It gives me great joy to perform new works by women. It's the sharing of the mentality and the spirituality and the speciality in our composure, as women, that it's really worth exploring.
The 50-50 gender pledge by the Proms does, however, not extend to soloists and conductors, but just contemporary composers. So why are concert organizers still reluctant to hire more women in the industry? I asked Robert Adediran at London Music Masters. The charity supports the involvement of young people in classical music.
We really have to go back to almost the foundations of classical music culture. Our institutions which we revere today and are very important to us were often founded, some of them, centuries ago. And at the time when those institutions were created, they were created in a space where it was very male dominant. Often women weren't allowed to work and didn't participate fully in creative life. And lots of those cultures have pervaded through across the centuries and the decades. And so we find ourselves with structures which have this bias kind of inherently built in.
Research by Dr. Christina Scharfs shows there are more girls than women who study music in schools and conservatoires, but at some point between studies and career, many appear to drop off the profession. 21-year-old composer Joanna Ward studied music at Cambridge University. She thinks the problem lies mainly in a lack of female role models in learning environments.
The works that you study, even contemporary works, are almost all by men, and the whole narrative is just that composers are male, and that's what the default is. It's also not even within institutions, just broadly. Women don't see other women becoming successful, so they think there's no point because it's a time commitment and it's a money commitment. Women have very good evidence to think maybe it's not worth it, or maybe it's not going to work out for me, or maybe I don't belong.
You have to look at what the profession looks and feels like for women who are entering it. You know, one of the reasons why women aren't aspiring to some of these roles is because they look at the job and they say, I don't want to do that. That doesn't look like a place where I can be my authentic self, where I will have peers who will support me, where I can, bring myself to work. That looks like the kind of job where I have to pretend to be a man in order to succeed. And if that's the case, then why would you do that? I mean, I wouldn't. It's not fair.
Institutions think that the new 50-50 gender pledge will help overcome the unconscious bias and promote talent. For others, much more needs to be done before our orchestras and concert halls can be fully inclusive.
You shouldn't do 50-50. You should do the best of this and the best of that. And then really the best will come out. Because then it becomes discrimination towards the men too, and also makes the women look weak.
We all have a responsibility to the next generation. And it's not about quotas and saying, oh, we just need to find some women so that there's some gender balance. It's about saying there are amazing musicians out there who are female and who have done great things, and it's important that we celebrate them.